Curtis Akers, and this is the Creating a Caring Church Conference. We've got Dr. Gerald Smith from Florida with us. He's going to be leading us in this conference this morning. It's a tag on to what we did last night. If you did not see that, you can go back and catch that one as well on Facebook. Hey, we're glad you're with us and glad you're tuned in. And we pray that this conference will be a blessing to you. Dr. Gerald Smith.
Thank you, Pastor Akers. Good morning. Good morning. Glad to see you today. You survived last night and came back, so that's a good thing. Just to recap what we did last night, we began talking about the biblical foundation of this. You know, what's the biblical idea behind it? It's the idea that ministry is to be shared. It's not something that is the purview and the property of someone who is on the pastoral staff, but the whole congregation, biblically speaking, is called to minister. And we have opportunities to do that throughout our normal everyday lives, where we work, where we live, our families, friends, co-workers. There are opportunities that will arise where we can minister and support people going through tough times. So that's what this has been about. We talked about ministry gifts, how the Bible teaches that ministry gifts are not for our use. They bless us, and it's wonderful to have the infilling of the Spirit and feel the power and presence of the Spirit. But the purpose of that is to empower us to minister to others. It's for the common good, Paul said. So, ministry, biblically speaking, corporate ministry of the body of Christ is the property of everybody. It's everybody's concern, and everybody should be about the Father's business of ministering to others who are in need. We started with the Good Samaritan story, and I think that's a great model for us. How here you had a man who wasn't on some sort of specialized outreach to care for people who were having a tough time. He was just going about his daily life, making a journey on his business, whatever that was, and encountered somebody who'd been beaten and robbed, and took the opportunity to be a blessing to him and minister to his needs. And we talked about how Jesus in that story used that story to flip the question about who is my neighbor, because that's what the lawyer asked. Well, who's my neighbor? Like, I can pick and choose who I want to help, or who might need my help, and who deserves my help. But Jesus, that's not the question. The question is, who was neighbor to the man? And it was the one who stopped and helped. So we want to be equipped for that. We want to be ready and prepared and equipped to be able to stop and help when someone says, hey, can I talk to you for just a minute? You know, about some concern or problem they might be having. And you'll be more confident and better able and better equipped to step up and say, sure, I got some time. Let's talk. So I think it's a wonderful way to minister. I think it opens up doors of opportunity. As I think it was John Maxwell said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Is that right? Is that who said it? Yes. So this is an opportunity to demonstrate care, and then it opens up opportunities to share about Jesus. Especially with younger people today who are so skeptical about things, it really is an opportunity to gain some entree, to gain some entrance into their life, so that then you gain the respectability, you gain the privilege of speaking to them about more important things, even about the Lord Jesus and what He can do for their lives. This morning we're going to begin by talking about grief. We talked about presence last night. Presence really is a foundational kind of skill. Everything else you do can be built up off of that, right? Presence is very, very important. Presence is the art of being intentionally present, of being focused on that person who is sitting with you, that you're with in the moment, bringing yourself back from all the distractions that inevitably happen to all of us when we're having conversations, and being aware of that and bringing yourself back to that person and back to that conversation and focusing on that person. We had some fun last night having a presence exercise where you got a chance to experience that, and it was fun to listen to your responses about what it felt like to have someone just listen. Just listen. How valued it makes us feel when someone just listens and doesn't try to judge, doesn't try to fix, doesn't try to paper over things, put a Band-Aid on it. or as the video said, yank the nail out, but just wants to listen, and it gives us an opportunity to process. And how important that is. We were discussing that again last night afterward about giving someone the opportunity to talk about something is the beginning of working through whatever that issue might be, right? You have to think about something in order to talk about it. So that's the beginning of you put some definition to it. This is what it is. This is what's going on. This is why it hurts, or this is why it bothers me. That's the beginning of working through it. And that's really an important part of presence and a really important part of ministry. So, talking about grief, today we're going to talk about grief, supporting people going through crisis times. Sometimes that is a grief experience as well. And supporting people who are in the hospital. Some important skills for doing that. If you're ever called upon to visit a friend or a family member, or if you're visiting on behalf of the congregation, you'll feel more comfortable in that environment after we get through that today. I'm pretty confident in that. So, all right, you ready? Grief. I call it the universal experience because everybody experiences grief. Whether or not, even a person who might be young in years, even if they've not had a death in their family, they've likely experienced grief. It's grief when anything or anyone in your life is taken out of your life, or that experience changes for you in some significant way. That's grief. Grief is, we think of it most often with death, and we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about some other ways that people experience grief. I really think, as a chaplain in my years of ministry, underneath it, or as a part of almost every other thing that I would talk to somebody about, underneath that was a lot of grief too. A lot of grief. And we'll talk about that. So grief, Jesus talked about that. I was joking yesterday about being a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief because I'm a Tennessee fan living in Gator country. So I'm more like Jesus than the people who are around me. And I was kidding, of course, but Jesus really was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And he gives us some really good examples of how to minister in grief, how to let ourselves experience grief. In the story with Lazarus' death, Jesus wasn't there when Lazarus died. And so when he gets there, his sister says, well, Lord, if you'd been here, he would have lived. He wouldn't have died. That showed a lot of confidence and faith in Jesus. And he said, well, it's good for you that I wasn't here. Which is kind of an odd statement, isn't it? But Jesus knew what else was going to happen, right? He knew what was coming next. So he said, it's really good for you to see what's about to happen here. But even knowing what is about to happen, you have Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, and he's weeping. The shortest verse in the Bible is filled with pain. He's weeping. Why is Jesus weeping? Well, because death had claimed someone he loved. And even though he knew what was about to happen, it grieved his heart that death does that, not just to Lazarus, but every other person on earth. And Jesus' ministry was about coming to address the effects of death in our lives and ultimately to give us life everlasting so that those of us who are in him, even though we die, yet shall we live. So Jesus came to conquer death, but he was fully aware of the pain that death causes, the experience of it personally to himself. So he wept. And what's interesting about that story is the next verse says that there were some people watching. And they said, look how much he loved him. There's the connection, isn't it? Grief happens because we love someone or something. Right? We love someone or something, and something changes. They die. It goes away. We no longer have that experience. We're no longer in the presence of that person. And our hearts ache. That's grief. Grief happens because we love someone. We may feel sad about hearing about people who died in the earthquake in Taiwan or some other tragedy around the world. We're human beings, so it affects us when we see hurting and suffering anywhere in the world. But it's a different experience when it happens to someone that you love. Because that's the key, isn't it? You love that person, and then when that person dies or something happens to that person, it's terribly sad. Okay, so grief happens with tragedies and deaths, but grief also happens with good things. So what? We were in a restaurant yesterday, and we got a chance to see an example of that. The waitress says, "I'm just sad because my son's going into high school." I'm like, well, it's a good thing that your kids grow up, right? I mean, they lived to high school. I joke around about how when I was a pastor in my early days, when my kids were small, I thought, I am such a great parent. I'm going to have perfect kids, and all that stuff. And, teenage years just kind of blew that confidence right out of the water. And after going through the teenage years with my kids, I said, here's what I think about parenting now. If you get your kids to 18 and they're alive, and they're not in jail, and they're not on drugs, you've done a pretty good job. So it's tough being a parent of a teenager. But she was sad because one stage of her life was ending, right? She enjoyed those younger years with her son. And now something else was happening. It's a good thing, but she misses that. That too is grief, right? When I walk my daughters down the aisle and give them away to that fine young man that was standing there waiting on us, that was happy and sad, right? Something significant was changing. Lots of blessings as a result of that, but I miss those years of them being in our house and young ladies and young girls and growing up with them. I miss all of that stuff. That's grief too. So how do we support people who are grieving? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so that's what today is about. How do we support people? Let's see. I got to remember how to work the slide. There we go. Press the button. Now, this is from a book by Charles Gherkin called Crisis Experience in Modern Life. And I apologize if the print is a little small, but I'll do what I can to kind of highlight. This is really, if you remember World Book and how they used to have those things about the human body and had the pages that kind of overlapped like that, and you can kind of go from the skeleton to the musculature and then add on the skin and all that kind of stuff. Well, this is actually several figures on top of each other. The very first one is the one that looks like, it's the one that's kind of like the, back, whoop. I need to go back. There, okay. I meant to use this button. There we go. The very first figure is the one that's like this. And what Gherkin says is that that's how we really, on an emotional level, think about our lives. It's like, we know that we're born and we know that we're going to die. We know there's a point at which we're going to die, but we think of it as kind of open-ended. Like, we're never going to die. It's kind of, psychologically speaking, it's like that's how we think about life. We don't spend our lives thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm going to die soon. We don't usually do that. We kind of think about the future as wide open. So that's the normal kind of thing for us kind of psychologically. We know on an intellectual level that, it comes to a point, that football comes to a point at some point and we die. Death is what's coming. We know that, right? So knowing that, he says that the difference between that expectation and reality, this part right here, the difference there between this expectation and this reality, says that's the space where anguish lives. So you have that expectation, but what happens is life impinges on that. Our life experience kind of says, oh wow, it really isn't wide open and an unending future. Death and illness and all kinds of aging, all that kind of presses in on us and we experience anguish. Well, part of that anguish is grief. So people going through the normal experience of life experience grief because of the stages of life that they go through, but also thinking about, if you think about, a normal life cycle, the average age of death for men and women is, somewhere in 70s, early 80s typically, but, men typically die sooner than women. I don't think that's fair, but not much I can do about it. But anyway, But think about what happens in a normal course of life. It's sad when someone dies, but there's an expectation that that's the way life is. You know, eventually we die, right? But think about what happens if someone dies unexpectedly, earlier in life. Okay? The degree of anguish is greater. My dad died at age 39. I was 12. That was a lot of anguish. I have a cousin whose granddaughter drowned last year in a pool. It's age 3, I think. And the anguish for that, because you know, you lose that little life that you love so much, but what you also lose is all that future that you thought was going to be there. So there's a ton of grief that goes with that. And being aware of those kinds of things. So the way of thinking about it is that in that space of anguish, where people are grieving, where life has pressed in on them, and they're aware of their mortality, and they're aware of you know, the coming time of death in their own life, or it happens to someone else that they love, in that space of anguish is an opportunity to demonstrate care and compassion and to be the loving heart and hands of Jesus. Right? So that's one of the reasons why I love this slide. I used to tell people, you see that space where it says anguish right there? They said, yeah. I said, that's where I live. Every day, walking into hospital rooms, that's where I live. I live in that space. And it was a wonderful privilege to be able to do that and to be there. But it was hard to hear those things sometimes, and then to also experience it yourself with some of the things that happen. Okay.
Jim,
Yes, sir.
the word starts with an M.
Yeah, that says menopause.
Menopause.
Yeah. So you're going through adulthood, you begin the aging process, you hit that wall of menopause, and life begins to change kind of radically, doesn't it? And we think of that as happening with only women, but it doesn't. It also happens to men. It's just a different kind of process, right? My experience of menopause with my grandson saying, hey, we're going to be playing tag football after church, and you're in pretty good shape. You want to come play with us? I went, no. No. Years ago, the last time I played tag football with your family and your dad and his uncles and all that stuff at Thanksgiving, you know, I did pretty good out there on the field, but I had a hard time walking for about 2 weeks. So no, I'll be happy to watch you play, but I'm not doing it. Well, that's menopause. You know, your abilities change. You can't do the things that you used to do as aging creeps in on us like that. And for women, of course, it kind of ends the childbearing years, and that's a tough thing. You know, to think that, oh my gosh, even though you might not even want children, you know, at that point, because just the thought that you can't have one, it's like, you know, well, it changes your sense of self as a person, doesn't it? I'm no longer a person who could have kids. Now I'm a person who can't have kids. That's grief, right? So those are the kinds of things that happen as you go through life in just kind of a developmental kind of way as well. And those are grief experiences. Okay, so let's talk about the effects of grief. There's a handout in your packet you can refer to that I have used for years and years and years, and it's called Normal Expressions of Grief.
Next to last or last page.
Okay, so why is it
I
this?
think it might be the next to last page. Normal expressions of grief.
Yes. Did you find it? Now, I have used that ever since I worked in hospice care years and years ago. So that's been, gosh, about 30 years ago. I first encountered this that somebody in our grief support department had done. And I found it so helpful. And now, when I share that with people, I've used it as a handout when somebody is grieving. You can do that as well if you like. But one of the things I would say is, here, I want to share this with you. And it talks about all the kinds of things that you can feel experience when you're grieving. And there's a long list of them there. I said, but what I want to call your attention to is the very first word on the page, normal. Normal. All of these things that are listed on this page would be normal for a person who is grieving the loss of someone they loved a lot to experience. All of them. Now, it's not normal to experience all of them at the same time. Okay? It's not, you don't have to experience all of them to be normal. It's just that if you experience some of these, any of these on that page, it would be normal. Grief is a whole person experience. It affects the way you feel sad, feel depressed, you can feel anxious, you can feel angry. It affects you emotionally, doesn't it? It's a powerful thing, and it affects our emotions way down deep. And the closer we are to the person who died, the more profoundly it affects us, the harder it is. It affects us physically. Grief is hard on the body, right? Anybody that's gone through a grieving experience knows it's very, very tiring. You don't feel like doing anything. Your energy level is just drained because you've expended so much emotional energy grieving. It's just hard, and it affects your body. You know, we talk about in Christian circles about how, you know, there's Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and there's Spirit, Soul, and body. So you have Trinity and Trinity, right? So we're a Trinitarian kind of, but our experience of that is of one person, right? Now, we might be able to conceptually talk about dividing, you know, soul and spirit and body and all that kind of stuff as a kind of an intellectual concept, but my experience is it's me, right? It's me. So when something affects me spiritually, it can also affect me physically and emotionally. When something affects me emotionally, it can affect me spiritually and physically. You ever had the flu really bad? I remember the first time this dawned on me that it was all connected. I had the flu really bad. I thought, you know, I don't feel real spiritual right now either. I just feel sick, you know. So, and that's the way it is when someone is very sick. And I would sometimes talk with people in the hospital and say, you know, I just don't feel like God's close. I just don't feel spiritual. I'm like, well, and it was helpful, it seemed, to explain that concept. Well, it's not surprising that you don't feel as spiritual as you often do because you're sick, right? And it affects your whole person. So that doesn't mean God is farther away. It doesn't mean God loves you less. It doesn't mean that you're less spiritual. It's just your experience of it right now is that you're sick and you can't really feel that closeness because your whole person is affected by that illness. People who are depressed, that's a mental, emotional kind of thing, but it affects them spiritually and physically as well. They don't have any energy, they feel lethargic, don't want to get out of bed. It's a really tough thing to go through. But grief is like that. It's a whole person experience. How you behave. You may be short-tempered, you might be, you know, angry, you know, you might feel like you just want to be away from everybody and everything. So grief is like that. So remembering that when people are grieving, there's a whole lot going on and it affects every part of their life. And to be a person filled with grace and understanding when you're listening to someone talk about their grief experience. Okay, let's see. Okay. Different kinds of grief. Acute's kind of a medical term, you know, when you have a sudden onset of an illness, you know, they call that an acute illness. You know, like if you have a heart attack, that's an acute event. Whereas if you have congestive heart failure, that's not really an acute event. It's kind of a gradual thing that happens. Because start is an acute event, but it kind of is a gradual thing. So grief, an acute event is a sudden, unexpected death, like my dad's. My dad died at work around midnight, and the next day our whole lives were changed. That's an acute event. For people who are experiencing death in that kind of event, It's sudden, it's shocking, and there's a sense of like, this just can't be real. You know, I mean, he was just here yesterday. You know, and everything seemed fine yesterday. There was no chance to prepare mentally, spiritually. There was no preparation. It's just suddenly it happened, and your life is upside down. So people who experience grief as an acute event, there's a shock value to it. And it's like for a while, they're in a fog. It's like it's difficult to function. It's difficult to think. It's difficult to do anything. You just kind of, you know, it's very difficult. So acute grief is like that. And with someone who's experienced that, remembering last night, presence is really powerful. You can't fix what happened. There's no turning the clock back to when it used to be so much better. Life has changed radically forever, and being with them in that moment is powerful. Just being there. Peter Keith said that, you know, about one of the other students that was in our class, our clinical pastoral education class, he was our supervisor, talking about him, he said he needs to be more and do less. He needs to be more and do less. He was talking about another student. But I thought, you know, that's powerful. When it comes to grief and supporting people who are grieving or going through crisis, we talked about presence as one of those foundational things, being more and doing less. Now, there are some things that you can do, and we'll talk about those, but primarily, especially in the beginning, focus on being the cat. Climbing up in that cone with the dog who had the, you know, we showed that video, that slide last night, just being the cat. Be the cat. And if you don't remember anything else from this weekend, be the cat. I'll show the slide again in a little bit. So chronic grief is a little different. Chronic grief is grief that occurs and it just continues and continues, and it doesn't have like an ending point. You know, Curtis was talking earlier about, you know, some changes in his mom after the first year, you know, because, you know, she's adjusting to life now without his dad. Chronic grief is like, you know, it doesn't change. It just is a continual event. It's a continual experience. It can be that with like a divorce. You know, it's like, you know, the dead person is walking around in the world with you still, you know. So it's not really over in some sense because that person's still alive. It's a different experience. So you continue the grieving experience because that experience of divorce is sort of a chronic kind of thing. And people do adjust, they move on with life, but especially in the early stages, it's a chronic thing. Another way of thinking about grief is like when you have a health change in your body. You know, there's another handout, I don't have it with me, but it's like loss of health, or health change, loss of health, and the symptoms are very similar to normal expressions of grief. For example, in the hospital, I would sometimes, you know, work with people who were, you know, diabetics, and they, because of the circulatory system, you know, and all that kind of stuff, they were, you know, about to have an amputation. Okay? Now, I don't know if anybody has ever had that. I don't think so, but if you think about what that might be like, that's a huge grief experience. You are a person who has 2 legs, and then the next day you're a person who has 1 and a part of 1. You're a person who used to be able to walk around on 2 legs. Now you need a wheelchair or crutches or something else. You had this sense of self, this is who I am, this is what I look like, and now I'm different. And grief is about, in that circumstance, missing the old person that you were. And it's very much like a death. That person's gone. He or she does not exist anymore. And there's a grief experience that goes with that. That's chronic grief. And then you have that continual experience of living life now as a person who has 1 and part of a leg as opposed to having two. So that's chronic grief. It's a continual experience. Complicated grief. A good example from the scriptures will be Job. That's complicated grief. You say, well, why is that complicated? Well, he lost his possessions, right? And he was a wealthy man. And then he lost his children, right? And then he lost his health. So that's when the grief experiences pile on top of each other. Instead of being a single event, there are multiple things that happen in quick succession. That's complicated. So if you don't have the opportunity to get through one grief experience before you get hit by another and another and another, and that's really difficult to process as a person because you don't have the time to do it. So when you have, a death of somebody in your family, and then, within the next year you have another death, and then you have another death, and they're all close to you, and you care about them, that's complicated. Now, you can imagine that if you had that kind of experience, that you might feel like Job in some sense. My goodness, I got a target on my back. What are you doing, God? Why am I being hit with all of these things at the same time? And so spiritually is a struggle, and mentally and physically is a struggle. So grief can be really hard when you're going through that kind of thing, right? So that requires a great deal of care and support, and is an opportunity for the church to recognize that somebody's going through something really, really difficult, and to just be there and be ready to care and support. Okay? So, disenfranchisement. That's a big word, and it's kind of like from the grief support professional kind of world, but it means that it's not recognized. It's not recognized as legitimate. So let's say that you have been married before and had children with your former spouse, and so throughout your life, even though you might have remarried and he might have been remarried, because of your children, you maintained a connection of sorts through the years, right? You probably communicated about care of the children and all those kinds of things. If you do it well, one hopes that you do that. And then that person dies. And you show up at the funeral. Does anybody recognize your grief? You had this life history with this person. You shared children with this person, but you're not the current spouse. He or she gets the attention, and they always say, oh, we love you so much and we're here for you. And then the former spouse, nobody recognizes it. That's disenfranchised grief. But it's real. So just being aware, if someone starts talking with you about, my ex-husband died or my ex-wife died, and I'm having a tough time with it. That's a real thing. So don't just minimize that and kind of sweep it under the rug. Really, it's your ex-husband. You should be happy. So, just kidding. But that's not real. It's real that because you had that connection, that it hurts, even though you're not the current spouse. So that's disenfranchised grief. All right. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Going back to complicated.
Yes.
Your last word, overdose. We, in this community, in our food pantry drive-through, 2 months ago, a mother comes up and she is just distraught.
Yeah.
3 children in 2 years.
Oh, wow.
From overdose.
Yeah.
This is something that's very real in Morgan County, Anderson County, Camden County. In the fentanyl overdoses are just, can you kind of address, is it a uniqueness or anything special, or how to treat that person who has lost someone to an overdose?
Well, there's sometimes a lot of guilt involved. I can't believe, I should have been able to prevent it, or I should have been able to see it coming, or, I should have been a better parent. So I think it's important to be aware of some of the things that might be beneath the grief. The grief is horrible, but just being ready to listen, being present, offering care and support. I don't think there's any magic to it. You're not going to make it go away. But just being aware, as you were, about how difficult it is. One child is hard. I can't imagine 3. I can't imagine 1. So complicated for a number of reasons. It's complicated because of the number of children who die. It's complicated because it's children. That's sometimes called an out-of-sequence loss. We have an expectation, not realistic all the time, that we'll die before our children, and that no parent should see the death of their child. That's kind of a modern thing. 100, 200 years ago, it was very common for people to see the death of their children. Children often didn't live past infancy or childhood with all the childhood diseases and stuff. So it's much more common for children to die back then. In our day, because of medical advances, immunization, all those kinds of things, we are much less likely to have the death of a child unless it's by accident or an overdose, homicide, suicide, something like that. So not by some, quote, natural causes. So it's really tough. And so I think just being aware of the difficulty and raising your own game, so to speak. So knowing that this isn't something that's going to be quickly resolved. This is a lifetime of suffering for this mom. And she's not ever going to be to the place where she's not grieving. She will never not be a grieving mom. So just being aware of that and being ready to walk with them through it. So complicated, when death is by somebody's murdered or somebody commits suicide, complete suicide, that's complicated as well because there's a whole lot of anger and hurt that happens when someone dies by suicide. People are angry at the person who did it. They're angry at themselves for maybe not recognizing the signs. I remember now. I should have been able to prevent this. Now I see. There's a lot of guilt involved in that. And sometimes there's a lot of anger and hurt because sometimes a person who dies by suicide does it to hurt somebody else. Particularly if they're in an intimate relationship with somebody and that person breaks up with them and then they commit suicide, there's a lot of anger and hurt involved in that. So just being aware of the different shades of grief. Grief comes in different kinds of things. It comes in different sizes, so to speak. There's grief, and there's grief. So, yeah, good question, Curtis. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. So let's see. All right. So let's talk about how we go through the flow of grief. So, anybody recognize this woman? Who is that? Yeah, who is that? Scarlett O'Hara. Remember Scarlett? So this is Scarlett after her husband, Charles, what was his name? Charles Hamilton. Charles Hamilton died, and so she's dressed in black. How long were they supposed to dress in black in those days? For a year. A whole year. Now, she made a mockery of it, but that's not the point. The point is that there was an expectation in former days. You don't just float through this thing quickly. Grief is hard. And you would go a whole year mourning the death of your husband or wife. A whole year. And society recognized that and gave honor to that. And times have changed so dramatically. So, now contrast that with Sleepless in Seattle. Tom Hanks, Megan, what's her name? Oh, shoot. Meg Ryan, thank you. Is that right? Yeah, okay. So his wife dies, and he's talking to his friend about, the policy at work. And the policy at work is you get 3 days off, and then you're supposed to be back to work just like usual. 3 days off. Well, now, I get that businesses can't give you a whole lot of time, but what happened is that society also kind of tags onto that. But, 3 days, you should be good by now. And that's just not real. Grief lasts a long time. And it changes in its shape and experience as time goes on, but it doesn't really ever go away. It just changes, right? So when you think about the trajectory, you were mentioning it earlier about your mom, the first year, 2 years is kind of a way to think about a normal kind. You really begin in the second year to re-engage with life. And it doesn't mean that you don't miss that person on those special days, on those anniversaries and birthdays. It's just that you're getting better at it. After my dad died, my mom made it a practice every year on the anniversary of his death to be out of the house doing something. She would not be in the house sitting around, experiencing the memories of my dad and his death. She planned to be going somewhere with friends, to be doing something outside the house so that she wouldn't be just sitting there. Now, that was her way of coping, but it kind of illustrates the point. Even years later, you don't stop grieving that person. It just gets different. It's different. Okay, so thinking about that though, everywhere you go around us are people who've experienced the death of somebody that they have loved deeply, and they're hurting. We were talking yesterday about the opportunities that might pop up and being ready for those opportunities. So understanding grief a little bit in a generalist kind of way, now you're better equipped to be a good listener, to be more present, and to give support to that person who might be experiencing grief 3 years after because today's his birthday, or today's her birthday, or today was our anniversary. It's just a hard day. And I'm at work and they're expecting me to function, but I'm thinking about him, or I'm thinking about her, and it's a hard day. And just having somebody be able to listen to that is powerful. Okay. So what helps? We've talked about some of that. This is a great story from the Bible, and I mentioned that. This is from Job chapter 2. And it says, when Job's 3 friends, now I'm going to mess up these names. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Isn't that a mouthful? I was joking with somebody the other day that nobody names their kid Maher-shalal-Hashbaz anymore, so it's one of Isaiah's boys, but it never caught on. So anyway, but those are hard names. So when they heard about Job's grief, they heard that he'd lost all of his possessions. They heard that his children had been killed in the storm, that crashed down, all of his kids had died. And Job's health was gone. And so they heard about Job, and they came to minister to him. So they came to sympathize with him and comfort him. That's a great goal, to sympathize with and comfort. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes, sprinkled dust, because he was sitting in an ash heap. He'd covered himself, with sackcloth and ashes and public kind of grieving display. And so they joined him. So they wept aloud and tore their robes, sprinkled dust. And when they sat on the ground for him for 7 days and 7 nights, no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. You can't get better grief ministry than that. That's the absolute best right there. If you can do that, you can minister powerfully to somebody that's grieving. Just get in it with them. Just get down beside them and sit with them. Walk with them. Give them a chance to talk and whatever they need to do, want to do. But just being there. But what happened after that? They messed it up. They started to talk. And here's some of the things, I don't know that they probably didn't say. Of course, with Job, what they were trying to say, well, you brought this on yourself. Surely you must have sinned. And so it was, and Job is about attacking that worldview that when bad things happen, it's because you did something bad. And that's not necessarily true. And so the book of Job is about that. But, we hear sometimes similar things when we're grieving. Well, they're in a better place. And they are. But that's not what you need to hear sometimes in that moment. God must have needed another rose for his garden. No! God's not so, but people do that to try to comfort us, but it doesn't work. It's not comforting. What's comforting is being there, listening, right? So remember Job and his sufferings, and remember his friends in the early days, and remember to be the cat. I keep thinking that when I press this button, it does that button, but it doesn't. so we showed this slide last night. So, see the cat up in the cone with the dog? That's a great symbol for us, a great illustration for us about how to be with people going through a tough time, particularly going through grief. Just be there with them. You're not going to be able to fix it. You can't, right? And that's not to say that there aren't some things that you can do, right? There are things you can do to be of help and support, and churches do some of that stuff really well. They bring meals and that kind of stuff and all that kind of stuff. But presence is the most powerful thing. Now, going back to sort of the trajectory. So if you think about that, and I mentioned that there's some in the packet that you have, that the first couple of weeks when someone dies is just really hard. But it's filled with all kinds of activity. When someone dies, family, usually, if you have family that cares about you, they show up. If you're part of a congregation, they show up. There are meals, and there's the funeral service, and everybody comes, and all that kind of stuff, and it's great. But after about 2 weeks, they've gone back home. The meals typically have stopped, and reality starts to set in. Okay? And if you're a working person, you have to go back to work, and you're still filled with grief, trying to function, trying to add and subtract, trying to do charts and graphs, or trying to do customer service, or whatever your job is. And it's a really difficult thing to do when your mind is just filled with grief and your heart aches. So after about 2 weeks, then 2 months is another time frame where it's reality is set in. The sense of absence, is just really profound. And then, as Curtis mentioned, the first year, all those things, all those first things, the first birthday, the first anniversary, the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, the first Easter, all those things, all those first things that used to be celebratory, now are just reminders of the pain, the reminders of the absence. So we'll talk a little bit about some strategies that you can offer people when they're dealing with those special days in a bit. But just remembering that, it's really, really difficult. So be the cat. Don't fall into the trap that Job's friends did and start to talk. And start to try, you really shouldn't feel so bad because, maybe God was protecting them from something worse that was going to happen later on in their life. That may be true, but that's not helpful, at least in my opinion. So, what's that? So somebody said, they died from a heart attack. At least that's better from having a slow, long death with cancer or something. So people have said stuff like that. It's like,
No, I heard that.
yes. Okay. So the next slide, I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit, but the next slide is talking about ways to support them in different kinds of ways, different times of the year, and different lengths of time. Now, an interesting thing about children, I don't have a lot of stuff about children in there, but for a while, I worked as a children's specialist for Brevard Hospice, and my job was to support kids who were grieving because someone else in their family was in hospice, or the child themselves was a hospice patient, had some sort of terminal disease. So my job was to support them and their families. Now, going into that, I didn't know a lot about children in grief, but I learned a lot through the experience. One of the things I learned by reading someone called Teresa Rando was that for children, it's very, very common for young children especially to stuff their grief, to act like nothing's even happened when mom or dad dies. Well, why is that? Well, because the surviving parent is a mess. And the child depends on the surviving parent for their existence, for their well-being. They depend on them, and they're a mess. So the child, as a way of protecting that need for security, stuffs it and will not add to the load that the surviving parent is bearing at the moment, will just stuff it down and act like nothing, just like normal life, until about 6 weeks down the road. About 6 weeks down the road, what happens is that surviving parent has started to kind of get back in life again and is not crying all the time, still has moments, but is functioning, is doing better. And so the child's like, okay, now it's my turn. Then all of a sudden at school, it might be a mess. Well, where'd that come from? That's normal for children. Children experience grief differently than adults. They don't often understand all the spiritualities that we understand. They don't understand the biology that we understand. They don't understand the life cycle stuff that we understand. So they experience it differently. For young children, you want to just maintain concrete kind of realities. Supporting that child with something like, listen, yes, so-and-so died, but there's always going to be someone here to care for you. That's awfully reassuring for a child. Right? And they will have questions. I don't know if you ever remember traveling with your children, when they were little tiny tykes, and they would say, how long till we get there? No answer worked. No answer worked. You try to do it, chronologically, in about 30 minutes, 10 minutes later. Are we there yet? How long is it going to be till we get there? We would travel from Indiana to Florida when our kids were little, and we tried to do it in terms of like how many Sesame Streets it was going to be. That didn't work either. It's going to be about 8 Sesame Streets more until we get there. So 5 minutes later, are we there yet? How long is it going to be? They don't understand it. Young children can't understand the kinds of things that we understand. So you put it into like concrete realities. So-and-so's body stopped working, and they just couldn't live anymore. So keep it concrete. With older kids and teenagers, you can get more philosophical. You can get to the spiritual things of life, and teens especially, they're not going to let you in on a whole lot because they tend to process that kind of stuff with their peer group. So they have a best friend that they'll talk about their grief and sadness with, and with you, it might seem like everything's fine, or they might just be angry, like a normal teenager. But anyway. But understanding that kids are different and giving them the space, and especially teenagers, when you're going through the experience of death and dying and the rituals and all those things, is offering them options and choices. Options and choices. We're going to go to the funeral home as a family. People are going to be gathered around. We're going to be there in the room with, the casket or whatever, And you can stay there if you like, but you don't have to. You can come and go as you like. If you need to leave, you can. So you give them options and choices. When the funeral service itself starts, when you're talking about that, listen, if you want to say something about your mom or dad or grandparent or whatever, you can, but you don't have to. If you want to just be with us, that's fine. Nobody's going to expect you to do something that you don't. So you give them options and choices. That's really important for teenagers as they're going through the grief experience. And they will take it in spurts. They will be really, really sad, and then they'll go outside and rip roar and play with friends and all that kind of stuff, like nothing happened. And then later on, so they'll have their recurring kind of grief moments. Whereas if you're the spouse or the parent, it's kind of a constant mess for you. But they kind of do it in and out kind of moments. Okay? So there are opportunities for us to demonstrate our love and concern. Now, think about this. So I have a friend who does this for me, and I thought, this is so meaningful. Here's a great opportunity for churches. My mom died on November the 4th, 2001. Herb Agee is a friend of mine. He's also a chaplain. And every November the 4th, I get an email that says, thinking about you today. He took about 30 seconds to set up a continuing email in his system that says, thinking about you today, November 4th, send to Gerald Smith. Took about 30 seconds to do that. Every year it pops up. I forget when my mother died sometimes. It's, I forget that this is the day, And so then that pops up and I was like, isn't that nice? So there's opportunities that we have with the technology that's available to just demonstrate care and concern in a really meaningful way when people in the congregation have experienced grief. So, right? Isn't that a great idea? Just set it up in your calendar, set it up in your system so that, bang, email goes out. And it's like, my church loves me. Isn't that great? Wouldn't that be good? All right. Let's see. Next slide. How are we doing time-wise? We'll be taking a break here in just a moment. This is my grief sermon. And whenever I would go to talk to somebody in the hospitals, I use this a lot, especially with moms who had an infant loss or a fetal demise. Fancy word saying the baby died. And I was, they'd be sad and stuff. But that too is a different kind of experience because, the baby was never born, so to speak. So sometimes people don't recognize that as a significant loss, but it's huge. So I would share that paper on normal expressions of grief, and I said, I'm going to give you my grief sermon. I said, I promise you it's really brief. Is that okay? Okay. So be as kind to yourself as you would be your very best friend if your very best friend was going through what you are right now. And the truth of the matter is, we're much better to our best friends than we are to ourselves. Our best friends will be having a tough time because they're grieving, and they'll say something like, I should be doing better by now. And if you're the best friend, you'll say, listen, give yourself a break. What you've experienced is really, really hard. Don't be so hard on yourself. Right? We do that for our best friends. Do that for yourself. So that's my grief sermon. You're welcome to borrow it. So it'll be in the slides when I send them to you, so you don't have to worry about writing it down so much. But be as kind to yourself. So give grace to yourself in the same way that you would to your very best friend who was going through a tough time. And then, let's see, I think this is the last. Yeah. So one more slide, and then we're going to take a break. The 4 R's. These are 4 R's, I think, that really help supporting someone who's grieving, help someone going through grief. The 4 R's. Being realistic. It's hard as all get out. It's not over quickly. It's a lifetime experience. You're going to grieve this significant death for the rest of your life. It's not always going to be as hard as it is right now, but it's never not going to matter. Okay? It's going to always be, you'll be different the rest of your life. I've become a fan of Toby Mac lately, the Christian singer Toby Mac, you know who he is? I didn't like him for a long time, but a couple of different things happened that make me really like him. One was I watched a video called Promised Land. If you haven't ever watched that on YouTube, I encourage you to watch it, Promised Land. It is just one of the best Christian music videos I've ever seen. The music's great, but the story in the video is amazing. It is so good. I encourage you to watch it. But his son died by suicide. And his latest song on the radio is Faithfully. And in it, I meant to print out the lyrics, but I forgot. He says, I'm not the man that I used to be. And he says, and later he says, I'm never going to be the person I used to be, but you were there faithfully. So it shows you the power of that grief experience for him. And he says it almost wrecked him. In the song he says, it almost took me down, he said. He says, it's been a hard year. It almost took me down. You ever had a hard year like that? Then you know what grief is like. That's what grief is like. So remembering that for yourself helps us identify with people who are grieving. So being realistic, rituals are extremely important. Curtis let me have a handout about funeral services in there. It's a great guide if you're ever a part of planning a funeral service, the important parts of that. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But rituals are very important. I'm not a fan of this no ritual kind of thing that people do sometimes these days. Oh, we're just not going to have anything. You know, I don't like that, because rituals give us an opportunity to honor and value the person who died, to honor and value our own experience of grief, and to have the support of family and friends and church around us. And so we get a sense that we're going through this with support, and that we matter, he mattered, she mattered, I matter, and I'm important, and people care about me, and it's so helpful, I think, to have rituals. So it can be a simple ritual, you know, you do all kinds of things. I've often encouraged people, you know, who weren't going to have a big public service to have something. So just gather in the yard and plant a tree, and let that be so-and-so's tree. And then every time you see that tree, you're reminded of your experience in life with that person, and then you can honor that person every time you see that tree. And so it's a ritual. Rituals are really helpful. We talked about grief being really tiring. Rest is important. It's hard to sleep. One of the things I did not like, and I would discourage, is when, you know, I'd have somebody grieving in the waiting room, in the emergency department, and somebody would come in being so upset about this person and wanting to jerk the nail out and fix them. So, hey, can I talk to the doctor? Can he give them something so they're not crying so much? I want to give them a sedative, because they were grieving. Well, you don't need a sedative when you're grieving. All that does is delay the inevitable. When the sedative wears off, you're right back there grieving. So it doesn't help. But people want to help, and they do some crazy kind of things. But rest is really important. Recreation. Whatever you need or whatever they need, encourage them to do the kinds of stuff that helps them feel restored. That's me in my kayak a few years back over on the Gulf Coast in Florida. I love to get out in the woods by myself, me and my kayak and my camera. You know, when I was thinking about buying a kayak, because I had that in mind, my friend Steve, we were looking at some. We were over on the West Coast vacationing together. We came across one that was a two-seater. He said, "Look, Gerald, here's a two-seater." I said, "Steve, what part of getting away from everybody and everything don't you understand?" So for me, it's a way of getting away. And I find it really peaceful and restorative. Other people have different methods, and people grieve differently. So help them explore options, things that help them to feel restored again. So that's okay. So this is a good time for us to take a break. Any quick questions before we do that? All right. So I don't know if we got an intermission sign or not, did we? So intermission. So take a few minutes, stretch your legs, get some coffee and donuts, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Okay, we're about ready to get started again. Thank you so much for your attention this morning. And we're rounding third base toward home. So to borrow, is this already going? Perfect. Okay, so welcome back. Those of you on Facebook, thanks for joining us again. We're going to be talking about, for the remaining part of our time together, about supporting people in crisis and hospital support, supporting people in the hospital situation. So that'll be what we do next. So probably at some point in your life you've gone through some sort of crisis event. Most of us have. One of the weird things about crisis is, even though it's a crisis, it's normal in some sense, because sooner or later you're going to experience one. And so that will help in terms of supporting other people. But I want to also kind of work on defining what a crisis is, kind of like how a crisis flows, and things that mitigate the crisis experience and keep it from becoming an overwhelming experience for somebody, and how to help people go through it. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look first at this next slide. So here's a crisis is usually a sudden event. If it happens gradually, it's usually not a crisis. So it's a sudden onset of some event that's usually big or a big impact for you in your life, that's a crisis or a crisis event. So normally in our lives, we develop some sort of our status quo. Our life is going pretty smooth until something else happens that disrupts it. So a crisis is a sudden disruptive event in your normally stable kind of life. So your sense of equilibrium, your sense of feeling like you're on solid ground and you're balanced. A crisis event makes it feel like everything is moving and shaking, kind of like trying to stand upright in an earthquake. I've not ever been through one, thank God, but something like that I would imagine. It just has that feeling of like nothing is stable, nothing is strong, and it feels like everything's going to collapse out from under you. That's what a crisis experience feels like to someone going through a real crisis. It becomes a crisis because when this event happens, your efforts to cope with it don't work. So if you could stop it or reverse it or get things back the way they were quickly, it wouldn't be a crisis. So it's when you try that and it doesn't work, then it's a crisis. So it disrupts your equilibrium, and we don't like that feeling of everything being unstable and like the ground's kind of fall out from under us. Nobody likes that. And we want to do what we can to restore our equilibrium as soon as possible. So there's a lot of emotional kind of pressure and force behind that. So there are different kinds of crises that people experience. There are some that are like internal kinds of things where you're experiencing some distress, dealing with anger, anxiety, hopelessness. Those are internal kinds of things. And sometimes it sounds odd, but some people really struggle with those kinds of things, and they have like a crisis event, and suddenly their anxiety is just through the roof, and they're not able to control that, and they don't know what to do about it and how to solve it. Then there are the sort of anticipated kinds of things. So they're a crisis, but in some ways, they're expected kinds of things. Life transition kinds of events. A death in the family. Your parents die. All those kinds of things. So it's a crisis in the moment, but they're kind of expected. So there are different kinds of things, and they feel different. What we commonly think of is the sudden traumatic kind of event. Somebody's in a car wreck. Somebody's a victim of crime. Some sort of stressful event like that. We have a crisis. It could be a crisis if you're the only breadwinner and the factory closes down unexpectedly. That's a crisis. So it's a sudden disruptive kind of event that feels like everything's out of your control and life is just spinning out of your ability to do anything about it. So there are developmental kinds of crises where people get at certain stages in life and they ought to move to the next thing, and for some reason they're stuck. They just can't do it. So they're in a developmental kind of crisis. There's a funny movie about that called Failure to Launch. You might have seen that, but that's a developmental kind of thing. You ought to be able to launch, and some people get stuck and need some help launching. So, and then there are the kinds of sort of mental, emotional kinds of crisis where people might have a psychiatric break or something, and they're in a crisis. They may have a recurring kind of condition psychologically or in psychiatric kind of need, and they have gone into a crisis of it. So sometimes like bipolar disorder could be one of those. So you have sort of a crisis where someone suddenly goes into one of those phases, and that can be really difficult as well. So let's talk about crises and the kinds of things that help. So this is kind of a way of thinking about where we are pre-crisis or before a crisis occurs. So that triangle looks pretty stable, that pyramid, it's solid base right there. And so you're kind of in that happy medium where you're not struggling to function, you're not dysfunctional, you're in that happy place and you're not being pushed beyond your normal limits, right? So it's kind of right there in the middle. Life is good. And we like it like that most of the time. So, but this is what a crisis feels like. That stability is turned on its head, and you can't balance that. It's going to fall one way or the other. And a crisis feels like, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know how my life is going to go. And it feels very disconcerting. So, but the goal of support is to help someone who's in that situation get back to a stability point so that they move from this being life on its head kind of experience to being in a new place of equilibrium that's better. So when someone's in a crisis, as a helping person, one of the things you can help them explore is, how do they see life? How do they understand God's providence, God's presence with them? And one of the ways they can sort of start getting a glimpse of that is if you're present, right? So it's easier to believe that God is with me if a person is with me. As one little kid said in Sunday school, I need some God with some skin on, right? We all need God with some skin on every now and then, right? Somebody who's with us in the moment that can help us. So some moments of crisis, some things about crisis like Romans 8:28, that's a popular scripture that many people can quote, all things work to good for those who love the Lord or are called according to His purpose. One of the things I like about that verse is when you look at it in different translations and in the Greek, remembering that Greek is pretty fluid and where words can appear in a sentence, is that the Greek verse really highlights the role of God in that. So really what it's trying to convince us of is that God is at work in all things for our good. Now, I like reminding people that verse does not say that all things are good. It doesn't say that all things feel good. It doesn't say we experience all the things that we have to experience in life and that they are good. They can be horrible things, but that even in the most horrible things, God's at work. God's at work, taking even the most horrible things to work them to our good. Isn't that amazing? That's the redemptive character of God, isn't it? He takes the hard things, the awful things that life throws at us, and He starts to work them for our good, to even take our bad experiences and use them for His glory. Paul talks about that. He says how our life experiences become these deep channels of blessings through which we can bless other people. So through our experience of pain, we're able then to, out of that pain, help somebody else going through it. So if we allow God to minister to us, to bring those good things out of our pain, we're more ready then to help someone going through crisis, to help them get to that place too. But it's not something you can rush, because, it's going to be fine. You don't want to minimize the experience and say, it's really nothing. It's going to be fine. You just wait and see. Well, right now it feels scary as all get out, and that's not helpful. So anyway, so the good news is that with some support, most people will get through a crisis successfully. Okay? Crisis is, by definition, it's a time-limited kind of event. It's not something that can last always. It's not possible for a crisis to last very long. The normal flow of a crisis is for about 4 to 6 weeks. By 4 to 6 weeks, it doesn't matter what's happened to you. At some point, almost 100% of the time, at 4 to 6 weeks, you're moving on to some way of coping with what's happened. You're at the next thing. So crisis doesn't last. Isn't that good news? But it's also good for us helping people is that, we're going to be here with you. And for you to know, likelihood is, for you don't have to panic about their experience either, because with support, most people, with time, with support, are going to get through it successfully. Okay? They'll be at a new place. So I apologize for the print being small, but this is sort of kind of like how it flows. There'll be another slide that happens after this, but it's like the normal state of equilibrium, that triangle, that solid base, and then it gets flipped on its head. There's a state of disequilibrium, and then there's our need to restore our equilibrium, to get things back to balance. So that's where we want to get to. So then that follows to this, right? So on the left side of the screen is if you go through this process, if you're able to have, realistic perceptions, okay, this isn't the end of the world, although it might feel like it at the moment. You have some sense, I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's going to work out. You have a realistic perception of things. You have really good emotional support. People care about you. People have gathered around you. You've got support. You've got coping mechanisms. You know how to deal with problems. You know how to begin to start to work through things. What's the next thing I need to do? Who do I need to contact? What's my next step? What action do I need to take next? You have some coping skills, and because of that, you're able to work through the problem and resolve it. If you do that, get your equilibrium back, no crisis, right? It can be a super stressful event, but if you have the resources and support that you need and the abilities to deal with it, it's not a crisis, okay? Now, resources are really important, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So on the right side is the opposite of that. The things that would help you get through the crisis quickly, successfully, are not present. The sense of proportion about the event is just way out of whack. So they don't have a real good understanding of what it is. They don't have good emotional support. Not able to cope. They don't have good coping mechanisms. Maybe it's the first time they've had a crisis like this in their life. The problem doesn't get resolved quickly because they don't know what to do. And so now it's a crisis. Okay? And they're in that point where, they got the base of the triangles here, the points down here. Something's going to happen. It can't just stay that way. So it's scary in that moment. That's why support is so important for us. And again, we talked earlier about how important presence is. Presence is really important in crisis as well. People in crisis, as I said yesterday, can't hear well. They can't think well. They're scared. And so presence is, you might be the wisest person since Solomon. And you might have wise words and all those things. The first time I learned that, I remember I was dealing with a young couple who was going through the death of their baby at the hospital in my chaplaincy training. And I remember, just sitting in the floor with them in the hallway. Just sitting. People don't remember what you might say. They'll remember your presence. Okay? So, all right. So, when someone's going through a crisis, and probably all of you have been through one or two or several in your lives, what helps? It's as easy as A, B, C, D. But it takes some work, takes some effort. So the first thing is establishing a connection. If it's somebody that you know, that's easier. If it's somebody from your congregation that you know, that's easier. You already have a connection. You have some rapport. But even then, you want to just reiterate, hey, listen, we love you very much. This is obviously a really, really hard day, but I want you to know that we're here with you. We're here with you. So just make a connection. So you don't have to worry about fixing it. But if it's somebody that you don't know, that happened a lot when I was a hospital chaplain. You pop into the emergency room, in the waiting room, somebody's, being coded over here in room 8, and family member is here. They don't know what's happening. And I want to tell you, physicians are often the worst when it comes with dealing with families. So, anyway, that's sidetracked. Apologize for that. Squirrel. So who was talking about ADD or ADHD the other day? So it's like, it's a squirrel. So, all right. So, but you have to make a connection quickly. So, I'll introduce myself. My name's Gerald. I'm the chaplain. I'm here to be with you while this is going on. And I would, say, what's your name? I didn't know them. So, so you get their name and you just kind of begin to make a connection. So, I would often ask, have you lived here in Titusville a long time? No, we just moved here from Iowa. Well, I know somebody from Iowa. So, little things like that, just to make a connection. Anything you can do to be less of a stranger is powerful. So any kind of little connection you can make. There's a great book out, I forget who wrote it, and it's called Connections, and that's where I got the idea from. Someone said, the secret to great preaching is knowing who to steal from. Right? So that's good. Everybody studies other people, and you learn from other people, so that's a good thing. But Larry Crabb, that's who it was. So the book was called Connection. He's talking about the power of that, and I thought that's really important. So I tried to put those kinds of things into practice. And connecting is just using some, where you have common ground, just enough to make that connection, but not to take over their story. And we'll talk more about that in the hospital support part too. But just enough to make a connection. Not like, going into some tangent about, well, I lived in Iowa for 12 years, and we lived in Des Moines, and it was great for us, and we loved it. I don't know what your experience was like, but we loved Iowa, except maybe the snow in the winter, but you don't do that. Just enough to connect, right? So, okay, so that's A, achieving some connection, establish rapport. B is you begin to break it down or boil it down to its primary elements. So that's where you get them to start talking. Tell me what happened today. Well, we were at Home Depot, and we paid and we walked out, and he just collapsed. This is a real event for me. He just collapsed right there in front of Home Depot. Right? So I'm talking to this person who I'd never met, and that's what she's going through. Okay? But by starting that process, tell me what happened. She's beginning to deal with it. It anchors her in the moment instead of, all the things that might be going to happen later and all that stuff. Just, it anchors, and she's beginning to process it. He didn't survive, by the way. And it's really a tough thing. Now, where doctors mess up sometimes is, I'm there trying to make a connection, offer support. They're working with the person trying to revive or save the person, right? The person here is anxious to know what's going on there. And if it lasts a long time, I would usually say, hang on just a minute, I'll go see if I can find out some information and come back for you. And I would share information as I could with the permission of the doctor. So, and then the doctor would come in, and at this point, she's wanting to know what happened. And the doctor would start what should have happened, with me long before. He doesn't need to. So can you tell me what happened today? Well, she don't want to go through that again. She wants to know what's happened now. So some doctors did it better than others, and I would commend the ones who didn't and offer suggestions to the ones, commend the ones who did it well. So the best way for a doctor to support that real quickly is the doctor say, you find out who she is, how she's related to him. He arrived here, this is what we found. We tried our best. He didn't make it. That's the best way. Absolute best way. When doctors did that, I almost would stand up and applaud. It was great. But when they went through this whole thing, because they're uncomfortable, nobody teaches them how to do this. They're uncomfortable talking about this stuff too, and they would kind of beat around the bush, and then finally get to it. Well, I'm sorry, he didn't make it. Well, you should have told me that 5 minutes ago. Right? So anyway, but breaking it down to its primary elements, this is what happened. Our house caught on fire. Everything was lost. Okay, so you start, who do you have for support? Right? So you begin to tell me what happened, what's going on. So, all right, so then comes C, which is challenging. Now, one of the things about crisis is people get immobilized in a crisis. You can't think straight. You don't know what to do next, right? You have to have someone prompting you a little bit about something to do. So people who are in a crisis get frozen in the moment, and they don't know how to take the next step, don't even know what to do sometimes next. So challenging to constructive action. You say, so is there someone that we can call for you? Is there someone that you need to talk to? Who do you need here with you right now? You say, and so they begin to think, right? And so then you say, would you like to call them? You want me to call them? And so, if it's like, notifying somebody of a death, usually I would encourage them to call one person have that one person then spread the word around with other family members so they don't have to make a ton of calls, right? But some constructive action, because what does that mean? I'm taking some control of this circumstance, even if it's just picking up the phone and calling my son and telling him that his dad died. I'm taking control. I've done something. I've taken an action. That gets you off the being immobilized to moving. That's the first step toward working through a crisis, is doing something constructive. Something that addresses what's happening. If it's, if you talk about the circumstance of your house burning down, what's the next thing? Call your insurance agent, right? Do you have that number? Oh yeah. So they call them. So it's constructive action. You get them moving in the direction of dealing with the crisis. And if you can get them doing that, it helps them move through it more quickly, more successfully. So then D is develop a plan for follow-up. So that's the next thing. So A, B, C, D, establish rapport, achieve connection, establish, break it down to its primary, tell me what happened, challenge to constructive action, get them doing something, moving through what needs to happen next to get them off of dead center, to get them moving towards resolving, and then develop a plan for follow-up. Hey, listen, can I check on you tomorrow? Would it be okay if I give you a call tomorrow? How about we meet next week for lunch or something? But you develop a plan. Okay, I'm going to call you tomorrow I'm going to come see you tomorrow so you develop a plan for follow-up. What does that do? That's the support, the situational support. I've got somebody who cares about me, who's walking with me through it. That helps so much. So this plan is important. So I think that's a really good way to begin to address somebody going through a critical event or a crisis event in their lives. Okay? So, all right. Okay. Now, crises can have positive outcomes. Most of us, because we like stress-free lives, and we like lives that are stable and at that point of equilibrium, what happens though is when life gets unsettled, we go through this event, there's the opportunity to grow, to get deeper in our faith, to gain life experiences and life skills that help us down the road when other things come, as they inevitably will, right? When you have the first death in your family, learning how to deal with grief equips you and prepares you for those times later in life when you're going to have others, because you will. So crisis is like that. Everybody's going to experience crisis. The goal of crisis is to help people as they're going through it, so they move through it successfully and they fall toward growth in their new stability. More confident, better able to handle the circumstances of life because they got through this. Does that make sense? So that's why crisis and helping someone in crisis is so important, is you can help them move toward resolving that and becoming a more confident, accomplished person in dealing with life. So now, relationships are hugely important with that. I mean, from a theological perspective, the idea is that, we're relational by character. God made us that way. God made us that way because God is that way. Father, Son, Spirit. Right? Father is been in eternal relationship with the Son in the Spirit. So that all three, God in one, God in relationship. Jesus says, I am the Father is in me. I love the Father loves me, right? So there's this relationship that's been there throughout all eternity. And so God, out of that relational character, created us as relational beings so that we could relate back to God and love Him as He loves us, but also with the capacity to relate and love each other. So we're relational by character because God made us in His image. Like Him, relational. So that's why in crisis, it's so important to have relationships in support. People who care about you. It's hugely discouraging to go through stuff alone. It's just hard. Nobody's meant to do that. We're not built that way. We need people. So when we're going through a crisis, it's even more important for people to be around us. So I kind of, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Here's my paraphrase of that. So, now abides resources, resilience, and relationships, and the greatest of these is relationships. So, relationships. Now, getting back to resources part, a crisis becomes a crisis because you can't deal with it. If you have a wreck and you total your car, but you got good insurance, and you got the money to get a new car, and nobody's injured, that's not really a crisis. That's a disruption, but it's not really a crisis. But if you're a young person and you bought this car and you paid cash and you don't have complete coverage and you have a wreck and it totals your car, that's the only way you have to get back and forth to work, and you don't have the money to get a new car, that's a crisis. You see? Resources make a huge difference. So in evaluating how people are dealing with the crisis, understanding their resources and their ability to deal with it is really important too. Okay? All right. Let's see. Next. Okay. Before we move on, any questions about crisis support? Yes?
So I'm sure you run across this, and I have many times. And I don't know if you can really address this. People have gaps in their spiritual and emotional lives, and they need crisis for the attention. And I've dealt with people, and it's been difficult to get people to move on and go where they need to go, do things they need to do, but they're clinging to the crisis because they get attention of it. What's your words of wisdom for that?
Well, you bring up a very important point, and that is having appropriate boundaries and having an appropriate sense of when to say, I've done all I can. Because you're right, some people thrive in that crisis. I knew one person whose dad was a very well-known minister in the Church of God, and she would get into these crisis kind of circumstances because that's the only time her dad really paid attention to her. He was, quote, so busy, that he didn't have time for her unless she was in some sort of crisis. And so she would kind of manufacture crises, maybe not even intentionally, but she was very prone to be in crisis kinds of things because it got her the attention that she really needed from her dad. That needs a different kind of care and support that we really can't provide. So, you can just do what you can, and then that's all you can do. And you have to be willing to say, I really don't know what else I can do to help you. But if you know of other resources, you can direct them there, whether that's, hey, listen, there's some great support available at, this counseling service or whatever, or maybe even, encouraging them to see. Sometimes pastoral support's really helpful that way too. Pastors are good counselors typically, and can help people with that sometimes to get through it. But that's a tough one. That's tough. Yes?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
My husband has been dead now just a little over 3 years. And the first year, I was in such deep, not just grief, I was in shock. It literally, I can't even find words to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
There is no words that can describe what I went through. I would come to church with a smile on my face. People say, how you doing? Fine, lying. I mean, that's a lie.
Yes.
And so after that first year, and it was torment, and I even started having nightmares. And one day, in answer to my brother's question, play God to the person. And the reason I say that, I was sitting on the couch one day, and I think a lot of people that go with depression and grief time are feeling a little sorry for themselves. And I was sitting there that day, and right in front of me, and this was a supernatural experience, it was God Himself, was standing right in front of me. And He spoke my name. He said, Faith, get up. Now go do what I've told you to do. So play God. Sometimes if a person, if they can't get out of that, you may have to get a little stern and say, quit feeling sorry for yourself. Move up, move on. But that is my experience.
Yeah. I think that's excellent. That brings up, one of the points I think you raised is that, the moving on to some sort of action is really important. And what you cannot do is take over the situation for them and try to do what they're not willing to do for themselves. We would, for example, we had a team that supported people who were going through domestic violence at the hospital. And one of the things we learned early on was that you couldn't do some things for that person. Like, you couldn't report it for them. You couldn't dial the phone to get the sheriff's office or the police department for them. You could do it, but then what that would do is that set them up for being able to deny that they ever did it when the abuser, confronted them about it. So we learned really quickly that, that person's got to dial the phone. That person's got to talk to the law enforcement. That person's got to tell them what happened and what they want to happen next. That person's got to do that in order to move through the crisis, and we can't do it for them. And sometimes, to your point, a person may go through it a number of times before they ever get to the point where they're willing to make that call.
Yes, and when this happened to me, I was in such deep shock. I couldn't complete a sentence without stuttering. I went in stuttering. I was trying to talk with Brother Akers one day, and I couldn't talk. I just put my hand over my mouth and shut up. I couldn't say it. It was stuttering. But I was deep, not just in grief. I was suffering shock because it was sudden.
Yeah.
And after a while, I went through that first year, really, bad situation. But after that was when, God loves us and He's patient with us and He supports us. But He does expect us after a while to do something about it.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I think that's, to his point, is that sometimes you have to, after a while of trying everything, and they keep, listen, you gotta do this yourself.
Yeah.
You gotta move on. Yes.
And on that line, don't you feel like sometimes it's they have a choice, because a lot of times when people go through crisis and refuse to come out of it are also people who can't live without drama in their life.
Yes.
Their comfort zone.
Yeah.
And they absolutely refuse, to be healed because it's, and everybody deals with crisis and drama different. But there's just some people in life that cannot survive without drama going on.
Exactly.
When a crisis happens, it's like, oh, this is the ultimate, and it becomes a comfort zone for them.
It's an attention getter.
It's an addiction.
Can be.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that, recognizing that we are practicing as a generalist and not a specialist, you can get to the point where you say, listen, I don't know what else I can do to be of help and support for you. Let me encourage you to try this instead. Okay? And then, if they will or they won't, but that's up to them, right? But, at some point you do have to be willing to draw a boundary line and say, I've really done all I'm able to do for you. As hard as that is, because as caring people, we don't want to do that.
We don't want to be enablers.
Right, exactly.
We don't want to be enablers, but yet at the same time, we want to be moved with compassion. Because I do this a lot in my teachings, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every time Jesus did anything, He was first moved by compassion. So I think the person's got to turn to God and has got to pray for themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
because this is bringing back
Yeah,
all the
yeah.
memories to me right now.
Yes, ma'am.
But I had a concrete made up mind that nothing was going to stop me.
Mm-hmm.
That God loved me, and I tell him this all the time, and this is something I think that everybody can do that would help everybody. God, I know you love me, and I know you love me, I love you.
Mm-hmm.
So, with this love relationship between me and my Father, I know that I can make it.
Yes. Excellent. Really good. Thank you so much for sharing. All right. So we're going to talk about hospital support. Somebody might know a little bit about. So, but let me backtrack a little bit and tell you about my first experience of going to see a friend in the hospital. So I was driving back to Lee College, and my friend Bobby Boykin, that I had gone to church with in Tallahassee when we lived there, was in the hospital in Atlanta. I don't know what he was, I still don't know why he was in Atlanta, but he was in the hospital in Atlanta. So I stopped by to see him. So I walked into his room, and I still remember Bobby laying there in the bed, and I remember, kind of pulling a chair up and seeing this machine beside the bed that I didn't know what it was. And I remember seeing this tube connected to the machine that went from the machine over to Bobby's bed and in Bobby's nose, and it disappeared. And there was this green, ugly looking stuff in the tube. And I remember almost being nauseous at the sight of it. So I haven't always been comfortable in the hospital, and you may not be comfortable in the hospital, but there are ways to become more comfortable, and there are ways to be more effective at supporting people in the hospital. Jesus said, I was sick and you visited me. He said, Lord, when did we see you sick? He says, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. So that's the concept, is that when we're ministering to people in the hospital, we're really ministering to Jesus, right? So if you have that in mind first, this is a ministry to the Lord. This is and this is why I'm here to visit this person. It's a ministry to this person. It's a ministry to Christ. Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Some people are hard to love. But if you conceptualize it like that, it helps you get past that and connect with that person and look past some of those prickly things that might make it difficult for you to love them. When you're going to go to the hospital, if possible, let somebody know you're going to come visit them. Because they may have scheduled tests and all those kinds of things. If you just show up, they might not even be in the room. So first of all, if you know somebody's in the hospital, you would call to see if they would appreciate a visit. Would you like me to visit? Yes or no? Yes? Okay. What time would be best? So you establish the time and you go then, right? Before you go, make that a matter of prayer. Lord, as I go to visit John, I pray, Lord, that you would use me to be a blessing to John today. Help me, Lord, to be a good listener. Help me to be present. Help me, Lord, to really offer care and support for John today. So you pray about it. So when you go to the hospital, even if you know this is John's room, you knock. So why do you knock? You ever been in the hospital? How many have been in the hospital before? Spent a night in the hospital? Anybody's never spent a night in the hospital? You've never spent the night in the hospital? Oh, you have? Anybody who hasn't? It's not a fun experience. I mean, you think about it for a second. You go to the hospital, they take your clothes, they give you their clothes. It's like being in prison, right? They give you their uniform, and it doesn't work well, right? So they give you this gown that just, it's designed for their benefit, not yours. And so they can get at whatever they need to get at quickly to help you if you're in trouble in the hospital. But it's not for your comfort. So it's not designed well for you anyway. So, while you're at the hospital, think of the other things that you're not in control of. People coming in your room. Doctor pops in when he or she feels good and ready, right? They come in at 4 o'clock in the morning and say, hey, I need to get some blood. I'm sleeping. I need to get some blood. They don't ask, they turn the light on, 4 o'clock in the morning. I need to get some blood. So you're not in control of, people coming in your room. You might have some limited choices about what you eat, but you might not be able to eat or drink if some test is coming up. You're not in control of that. Somebody else has told you what's going to happen there. So it's a feeling of being out of control, of not being in control of your own life. That's the first experience of being a hospital patient. Out of control. So what happens when you come to somebody in a hospital, and even though they know who you are, and you talked about coming, you knock on the door, hey, it's Gerald, is this a good time to come in? What did you just do? You gave them a choice. You gave them power, an option to make a decision. Nobody else is allowing them to make decisions, about much of anything. Can I come in? Yeah, you come in. All right? So, now when you go into the hospital room, if possible, sit down. Sometimes there's not chairs in the room, but most often there are. So it's best to sit down. Why is that? Well, think about, just imagine for a moment that, in front of me is the hospital bed and I'm coming to visit. This is the person's head right here and their feet are down here, okay? I'm coming to visit and I'm standing over the bed like this, looking down, okay? And you're the person in the bed looking up, right? That's not an equal position. It's over, under, right? So already that's an uncomfortable place to be. Much better, hey, would it be okay? Now again, giving choice, options. Can I pull up a chair? Sure, have a seat. Okay? Again, you're giving them the option. So you pull up a chair and you sit down. Then you're on eye level. So roughly, same place, right? That feels better. That feels more like with me instead of over me. Okay? Again, we're talking about presence, right? That feels like with me, not over me. So can I take a seat? Sure. Now, where do you put the chair?
Where they can see you.
Good. Where they can see you. Okay. Typically, if it's a room with a window, not between the bed and the window. Why? Yeah, and there's bright light behind you, and your face is darkened. They can't see your facial expressions as well, right? So you don't want that. You want to sit where you're not in between them and the window. Okay. Where's the chair?
Within reach, but let them, like where you could touch each other, but you don't force it.
Good. Good. What's that?
Bedside.
Bedside. Typically about where their knees would be. Okay? The place where you do not want to be, ever, is the end of the bed. Okay? Why is that? Remember that hospital gown? You don't want any surprises. Okay? It's almost impossible to be modest with one of those things on. Okay? So off to the side, it's much easier. No surprises. Okay? And also, if for example, they have to get up to go to the restroom or they're coming back from a test and they're getting into bed, it's really, really nice to either step outside and wait while they're getting back into bed, or I would say, listen, I'm just going to turn around for a second. You let me know when you're ready. Okay? Again, you don't want any surprises. If you do get surprises, please don't act shocked and, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's like, sometimes those things just happen and nobody can help it. Okay? But do your best to maintain your own sense of decorum and try not to make them feel embarrassed. But you give yourself the best option of avoiding that by sitting right about the knee. Okay? That way, as you said, if they want you to hold their hand or whatever, you can do that. Okay? So that's great. So if other people happen to be in the room, like other family members, or people that you don't know, introduce yourself. Hi, my name's Alice. I'm with the Clinton Church of God, and I'm just so happy to be here with, to come visit. And so, how are you guys related? So, no assumptions about how they're related, because you can mess up that way. I did that a few times. So, are you the wife? No, I'm the girlfriend. The wife is. So no surprises. You just ask them how they're related to whoever's in the bed. Well, I'm his sister, or I'm his brother, or whatever. So, oh, okay, great. And then, then you continue your visit and you renew your focus, focusing primarily on, you might, again, establish some rapport. That's a good opportunity as well. So, you guys live here in town? Well, no, we're from Pennsylvania. Oh, well, my neighbor Chris is from Pennsylvania. What part of Pennsylvania are you guys from? So again, it's establishing rapport. You're less of a stranger, okay? If you can just do simple things like that, make a connection, and focus your attention back on the person that you came to see. Okay? That makes sense so far? Okay. Now, the things you're going to see in a hospital can be kind of weird too, like that gastrointestinal pump, the tube down his nose, nasal gastro thing. Now I know what it is, and it's still gross, but I'm used to it. Get used to machines like, there might be monitors of some kind and all kinds of wavy lines and machines, and they might be on they might have a mask on, non-rebreather they call them. So different kinds of things, contraptions they are. Just be prepared to see unusual things. And if you don't know what something is, you can say, oh, I've not ever seen one of those. What is that? It's okay to ask questions, especially if the nurse is there, doctor's there, you can ask questions. Doctors probably won't answer you. They're in and out so fast. But just, that's establishing rapport, picking your spot, asking for permission to sit down, because again, being in the hospital feels like you're out of control in so many ways, and the more ways you can give options about what that person can do, decisions they can make, the better. Okay? So then you can begin, and some people say, you should never ask what's going on with somebody who's in the hospital, and I don't think that's true. I'd say, hey, listen, what in the world happened that you ended up here in the hospital? Most of the time they want to talk about it if you can ask about it in the right way. Okay? So, things are important. These are important for any kind of support, but especially in a hospital. Listening and attending skills, that's, do you know how to listen well? We talked about that last night and again today. Observing the environment. What are you seeing in the room? What machines are you seeing? What kind of personal effects are in the room? Do you see a Bible on the table? Do you see cards or flowers? What are you seeing in the room? What's the room like? Is the room well lit with the blinds open? Or is it darkened? And, sometimes that's a clue about how a person might be feeling. Sometimes it's just that they didn't get into the room till like 2 o'clock this morning and they haven't had any sleep and they just want to sleep. So it can be dark just for that reason. But just kind of pay attention to what you're seeing and think, I wonder if that's significant or not. So just thinking about those kinds of things, being aware of what you're seeing, okay? Verbal and nonverbal communication for yourself and for them, okay? So observing things like, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, if they wince when they move, if they're having trouble breathing, verbal, nonverbal, just picking up all those kind of cues. We talked again just a little while ago about the proper use of ourselves to connect. When I was doing my training at UT Medical Center, I was, the chaplain on call. Once a week, you'd be the chaplain on call, and you'd, do your normal daily stuff, training as a chaplain, and that night you would stay the next night. You would stay all through the next day. So during the night, I don't know what time it was. It was after midnight, and the pager goes off. We don't even have pagers anymore. We used to call the phone. But anyway, pager went off. And so it said, so I called her. I said, they want to see you in room, I forget the room number. I said, well, and usually if you get awakened in the middle of the night, you wonder why. So I'm like, well, can you tell me a little about what happened? Yeah, somebody died and they want support. Okay. So I wouldn't typically get up for nothing. Somebody would say, oh, somebody's just upset and wants to talk to the chaplain. I was like, well, are they going to be here in the morning? Yes, I'll see them then. But if it was something significant, I didn't mind getting up and going, but it needed to be something important. So anyway, I go to the room and I open up the door and knock. Hey, my name's Gerald, I'm the chaplain. And I walk in, there's a room full of people. There's a gentleman that's in the bed, And, people gathered around the bed, 5 or 6 people. There's a chair over here against the wall, and there's a young boy sitting in the chair. And so, as a chaplain, you don't just barge in and take over the room. So I just kind of walked in for a little bit and kind of, took stock of the situation and just hung out for a bit. And I went over to where the young boy was sitting. It was one of those oversized chairs with a big old arm on it. They don't even do those in hospitals anymore, but that's the way it was. And so I just kind of, sat a little bit on the edge of the chair, and I looked at him and I said, "Hey, what's your name?" He told me what his name is. I said, "How are you related to him?" He said, "That's my dad." And his dad had died. I said, "How old are you?" He says, "I'm 12. I was 12 when my dad died. He says, okay. That's a good use of self. It would have gone off the edge and off the rails if I had said, and my experience was, I didn't cry for several weeks, when my dad died. And when I went to the funeral, it was just like, I just kind of sat there and didn't really do much. And it just didn't really hit me much until later. You know what I mean? If I had gone through all that, just enough to connect. He's like, so went through, met some of the other family, we prayed together and all that kind of stuff. But it's important that you understand how to use your own experience in these settings. I had one of my volunteer team who had been a very good singer before she had a stroke. And she sang opera in the area around Washington, D.C., and would do a lot of events and stuff and sing opera. Well, she had this major stroke, and she could no longer sing, and she could barely get around, and her husband would help her come to the hospital to do visitation and stuff, and would push her to the door of the room, and at that time she could get up and move a bit, or sometimes he would just push her into the room and then wait outside while she visited and come back in. And she was a good volunteer, but after her very first visit, she was up on the 4th floor, which is where stroke patients would be for our hospital. And she says, I got to visit somebody who had a stroke today. She says, I told her I knew exactly what she was going through. I went, do you really? So let's talk about that for just a bit. So we did. And so she understood very quickly that though she had a stroke and she had a stroke, their experiences were not exactly alike. There were some similarities. They're both difficult things. They both had difficult experiences, but they're not the same person. They didn't have the same losses because of the stroke. They're different people. Their experience has been different. It would have been better, and she received it so well. It would have been better said, I had a stroke too. Tell me what this has been like for you. See? So if somebody's had a death in your family or whatever, and you're supporting them, I've experienced that too. Tell me what it's been like for you. So you don't take it over and it becomes your story. It's all about them. Does that make sense? Okay. So proper use of self. Let's see. I keep doing the same thing, thinking I press this button and it makes this work, and it doesn't. So being attentive, being aware of your own tone of voice, calm, gentle kind of speech. Humor can be great in the right circumstances, and you can play with that a little bit. And if you're a reasonable person, you probably can tell pretty quickly when humor's appropriate and when it's not. But I would use humor as a diagnostic skill, as a tool. If somebody can laugh at a joke that they ought to laugh at, mentally they were doing pretty well, okay. But if it was something they should have laughed at, but you pick your moments. There are the right times to do that, and there are times you shouldn't do that, obviously. But facial expressions, are they crying, or when you see a tear, don't automatically take a tissue and say, here, wipe your tears. What's another thing you can do instead?
Be quiet.
You can be quiet, which is really hard. Okay? You can say, hey, I see that tear. What's that about? Tell me what that tear's about. I'm worried about the test results. So it's information. And when they allow you in and you can see something like that, it's like they're giving you a gift. Okay? Don't take a tissue and wipe it away. Receive the gift. Okay? So tell me what that's about. They're giving you a gift. So facial expression, tears, color, their breathing, is it labored, is it easy? So paying attention to all of that stuff, those are all informational things that help as you're ministering to this person. So again, paying attention to the external environment, the room, what's going on there, paying attention to the person, paying attention to yourself. As we mentioned last night, your feelings are very important pieces of information too. What are you feeling? And when they start talking about what they're going through, if you feel sad, it's okay sometimes to say, oh man, I hear that and I just feel I feel sad. It's okay. It's identifying with that person. Okay, let's see. So you can, recapping some of the things we said, how are things going today, speaking calmly. This one I like. When they're in the hospital, you can kind of gently remind them of God's grace by saying, I've known you for a long time. Tell me ways that God has helped you in the past. Tell me about other times in your life when you're going through a tough time. How did God show up? It's like, and then they start to recall that. And it helps them, if God showed up back then, maybe God will show up today, right? So that's good.
What was that last one?
Reminding them of God's love. You're going to get these slides. You don't have to write so hard. So
It helps me.
it helps you write? Yeah, me too. I do the same thing. Okay. Let's see. Next. So we practiced this last night, but this is a good time to also do this about praying for somebody else. But now, interestingly, hospital visits often have a ritual. They've often become, I would notice other pastors and stuff coming to, church, they had a ritual to it, especially pastoral visits. So here's the ritual. Walk in, heard you in the hospital, just want you to know we love you, we're praying for you, anything we can do for you right now? No? Okay, all right. So, can I pray for you? Sure, okay, all right, we'll see you again soon. So I didn't mean longer, but that's typically how it would flow. And oftentimes they would not even sit down. Okay? So, if you really want to get past the surface stuff, let me encourage you to not be in a hurry. Ask them if you can sit down. And as Maggie said a little while ago, don't talk. Most people are not comfortable with silence. So if you can control your own urge to fill it up with your voice, it's likely that they'll get a little uncomfortable and they'll start talking. Okay? Little trick, tools of trade, right? So they'll start talking. And again, as we practiced last night, don't try to take over the conversation. You can gently guide it. Tell me more about that. So I would tell my volunteers, your goal is not to drive the car. Your goal is to get in the car with somebody who's taking their Sunday drive and make comments about the journey. So you're sitting in the passenger seat. They're driving along, they're telling you their story, they're going this way and that, telling you about what happened and how they felt and whatever. Your goal isn't to say, hey, stop the car. Your goal is not to hit the brakes, press the gas. Your goal is to sit in the car and say, you all of a sudden you brought this up. Tell me more about that. So it's paying attention to the scenery. Aren't the trees beautiful this time of year? But you're not driving the car. You're along for the ride, and they're driving. So being quiet, helping to kind of keep the conversation going, encouraging them to talk about their experience. So that's a tough thing because we don't like silence either, and we want to fill it up with our own voice. We want to do something, say something, makes them feel better, and we don't like being quiet either. So It's kind of one of those things that you'll need to practice it. It's not easy, but as you saw last night, you can do it, right? Okay. So, as the conversation goes on, like last night we were talking about, you're listening to what they're saying. They might be talking about, the tests that they've had taken and they're waiting for results. They might be talking about, their concerns about how they're going to function after this illness, if they're, or what the treatments are going to be like. They might be talking about all kinds of things that are on their mind, and you're listening very carefully. At the conclusion of it, you may say, hey, listen, before I go, would it be okay if we had a prayer together? Now, as a chaplain meeting somebody I didn't know for the first time, I didn't do that. I would say, enjoyed this conversation. What else can I do for you today, knowing that I'm the chaplain? Most often they would say, we'd love it if you'd say a prayer for me. So, okay, so what should we pray about? So get it, I've been listening. Now I ask them the question, what's important for you for us to pray about? Okay? So I left out a couple of words in it. What would be important for you to include in our prayer? So a couple of words outside. I noticed that. You editors out there, you caught me. All right, so anyway, so you do that, and just as we did last night, you include in the prayer what you heard in conversation and what they mentioned specifically. Okay? And again, it's that power of, oh my goodness, they were listening to me. They heard what I said. I matter to them. And here's the connection that often gets made. I matter to them. Maybe I matter to God too. Okay? So that's why it's important. And when you pray, keep it brief. Don't do a prayer so loud they can hear it down the hall, past the nursing station, 2 floors down. Just so it's in the room. Keep it brief. Okay. So you don't have to do the. There's a great story that Chuck Swindoll told one time about prayer that I've always loved. He said there was this college, and they were having financial struggles. And so they were going around the table, and all the board was praying about the financial struggles, and there were all the, oh God, thou who sittest in the heavens, and all that, this real flowery language and praying and stuff. Finally, they got to one guy who says, oh God, you own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Sell some of them and send us the money. That's a good prayer. And according to Chuck Swindoll, somebody knocked on the door and said, hey, I'm a cattle rancher from Oklahoma. I just sold a bunch of cows, and God told me to give you the money. So you can keep it simple and keep it brief and still be powerful. Okay? All right. Let's see. What else is next? And that's it. So, any questions about hospital support that might have been prompted by our conversation today?
Information that you find out in the hospital about the patient under HIPAA and other.
Great, thank you. Which also prompts me to say a couple other things. First, HIPAA. It's not spelled HIPPA, it's HIPAA. A little point of information. So, patient information is highly confidential. So, even if you're visiting somebody from the church, without their permission, do not blab it all over church. You can say, hey, may I share this with the pastor? May we share your concerns on our prayer line? But ask their permission about sharing stuff. My wife taught school, and she had several times the experience of people saying, hey, I saw your husband when I was in the hospital. Did he tell you? She's like, no. Because I didn't ask them. Unless they said, hey, tell Sherry I said hey, or something like that. They never found out. Or she never found out they were in the hospital. So it's highly confidential. Secondly, pay attention. I meant to mention this one. Pay attention to what you're seeing. As at the door, typically if there are isolation precautions or any kind of precautions of any kind, they're going to be posted on the door. Okay? There could be, contact precautions. That's where you have to be careful about what you touch, because whatever it is they have is communicated by contact. So contact precautions, typically you could gown up and wear gloves and go in and be fine. And then when you leave, you take the gown off, take the gloves off, wash your hands, and leave. Okay? So contact precaution. There's droplet precautions, those. So that's like if you have cold or flu and you sneeze, the droplets come out, and if you see it like with sunlight behind it, the droplets would be like, they would go out and they fall to the ground, about 3 or 4 feet out, right? Droplet precautions. So that's good. Wear a mask. Okay, that's great for droplets. Airborne precautions, you probably are not going to be going in the room anyway. But airborne particles, they float in the air, kind of like when you see sunlight through a window and you see particles floating. Airborne precautions is like that. You need a special kind of mask for that. But what I would encourage you to do is pay attention to the signs and ask a nurse if you don't know what it means. Okay? Secondly, if you happen to see one that says NPO, what does that mean? Nothing by mouth. Right? It's a Latin phrase, but that's what it means, right? So you can mess up a lot of people's day if you don't pay attention to that. If somebody in their thirstiness and forgetfulness says, hey, I really could use a drink of water, and you give them a drink of water and they're NPO, non-per or whatever. So if you give them you can mess up their whole schedule. You can mess up, they might be having a test that's already scheduled, got to be rescheduled for tomorrow. A lot of money wasted, a lot of time wasted. They're going to be out of the hospital later. Not a good thing. Pay attention to those things. If you don't understand it, please ask a nurse or someone else around. Okay? Yes?
So this might come as this might be considered just common sense, but I think I need to ask it anyway. Like if you're in there and something bizarre happens, you're close to the friend, let's say you are, you may not be, but whether you are or not, if there's something that they're doing that you're like, if this was my mom, I'd be like, no, get back in the bed, you're about to, something that you need to step in, but you're not the immediate family member, or like, how do you, with discretion and kindness and dignity, get the nurse? Or what, you know what I mean? How do you intervene if you need to intervene?
Yeah.
If you're there alone with someone and they're doing something, or either something's happened or they're starting to do something, if they're not thinking clearly and they're...
Okay.
So how do you do that?
Great. Typically on the bed, there's a button for the nurse call right there. So you can do that. If they don't come quickly, just yell.
So you don't necessarily owe the person anything. You can just do that.
Yes. If you think they're in danger in some way because they're doing something that's not safe, or something is happening that you think is kind of weird, maybe their breathing changed and or they're just going to suddenly go unconscious, absolutely, get help. So you can press the button immediately, holler real loud if they're trying to get out of bed, but they're on fall precautions or something like that, so they shouldn't be getting out of bed without help. Say, hey, wait, please, wait, let's get a nurse to help you. And they say, well, you can help me. No, I don't really know what I'm doing. You need a professional to help you so that you don't get hurt. So, so it's absolutely okay to do that.
Okay, second question.
Okay.
And this is something that I've thought about forever. In any kind of conversation, especially with any kind of grief or when you're trying to counsel somebody, when we know that they have the hope, when we know that they're saved, it's a lot easier to remind them of His faithfulness and love.
Yes.
If you're going in, as a pastor and you're doing these, you say you might leave prayer out of it unless they ask. If you're going in as a clergyman, you know what I mean? But if we're lay people, and we also are obedient to the Spirit, so if the Spirit moves us to say, can we pray with you or whatever, that's all. I guess I'm getting wordy, but I guess my question is, how do you console somebody that does not have hope? and is not saved. And if you are dealing with someone who is saved, and there's the survivor, and the deceased or sick or impaired is not, that is the deepest problem that I can fathom.
Yeah.
And how, because you don't want to jump into missionary mode, but how do you, because the fear of is like, being the preacher of an unsafe person, or speaking their obituary. You're not going to lie. What are you going to do? So as a layperson, have you got any words for us about that? How to navigate those waters?
Well, carefully is the first point. But I think there's always the opportunity when someone is not a Christian for you to say, this is what helps me. Let me tell you about what helps me when I'm going through a tough time. Okay? Then it becomes, basically a witness, a testimony, and it's not beating them over the head about what they don't have. It's about sharing what you know. This is what helps me. I believe God loves me. I believe God loves you. And when I'm going through a tough time, it's so good to be able to take it to the Lord in prayer, to know that God loves me, cares for me. Okay? So
Well, then how do you offer any consolation at all to the person who is grieving the loss of someone who's in hell?
well, that's difficult as well. Difficult as well. So
Just attend to their immediate needs?
I think so. It's not. I don't think it's a time in that circumstance to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that your loved one, is in hell."
Obviously.
Yeah. So, but loving, caring support will give you the opportunity to continue to have a part in their life and be a person that they think of as someone who demonstrates love and grace and compassion the way Jesus did. And that's powerfully attractive.
Can I say something?
Sure.
When people are desperate, that's the moment that most people, even if they're not saved, my husband and I experienced he's a pastor, and when we would visit someone like that, we found they wanted you to pray. Most of the time, we didn't even have to ask. They would ask us.
Yes.
And then another thing, if you minister to a person that thinks that their loved one has gotten going to hell, the way we always ministered that was, you don't know that. They could have prayed before they died, like the third man on the cross. And that gives comfort. That gives them hope. It may not give them a complete answer.
Right.
But it gives them hope that they did pray and that they will see him in heaven someday.
Yeah, you bring up a couple of good points. I remember, again, when I was doing my chaplaincy training, I talked to someone that was in the trauma intensive care unit who'd been in a car accident, and they'd had her in an induced coma for several weeks while her body continued to. They would do that because they don't want you struggling to breathe, working hard to do that, so your body, just all the energy goes toward healing instead of all the other work. They can kind of take some of that off. But anyway, so she came, when they brought her up from that coma, gave her the medicine to reverse it. I was talking with her, she said, I had the best conversations with Jesus while I was out. And I've always thought, to your point, you never know what is going on, what God might be doing. And I never lose hope on anybody.
One of the things that I use in that situation is, here's something I've learned about my Father. He loves us more than we love anybody.
That's right.
And if there was anybody that I felt like I can trust with my loved one, I know that it's my Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
And so whatever my Father, who loves us so much, is going to do, I know this is going to be right. You're not sending them to heaven or to hell.
Right.
You're putting them in the hands of God. They made the choices, they made the decision. But you're letting that individual know, but God loved that individual even more than you love that individual. And He's going to do what is right accordingly.
Good. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you so much for your kind attention and your support the last couple of days. I've enjoyed being here with you very much. I'm so thankful for the ministry of this church. You do so much good in the community. You have big old hearts, and I have every confidence that you'll continue to make a huge impact in Clinton and beyond. God bless you.